Hi, and welcome back to another story time. We have the seventh day ox. We're somewhere in the middle, so let's get started. Chapter 18. Late one afternoon, Yuri came into the stable quite unexpectedly. He pushed and pulled Nikolai's wooden crate to a dark corner of the stable, away from the doorway and the chilly winds that sometimes blew when the door was open. Nikolai was surprised at the ease with which Yuri moved the box, but then he realized that he was not the stout man he once was. Even through his coat, he could feel his ribs. When Yuri began forking hay up around the crate, Nikolai's heart was touched. The hay would do wonders to insulate him against the cold winter air. Now, beyond a shadow of a doubt, he knew the guard really did care what happened to him. "Thank you," was all Nikolai said, but the two of them knew what such a gesture could truly mean to Nikolai. It would very likely save his life. Nikolai was sure that Yuri was acting on his own, and that the warden knew nothing of Yuri's thoughtful deeds. The food he had brought, the water, the blankets, and the hay piled high around his box, all were simple acts of kindness, and yet ones that couldn't be misconstrued. The cold days of winter turned to a wet spring. Unable to move about in the box when he was in prison there, the damp air chilled Nikolai to the bone. He wasn't sure which was worse, the frigid, mild-numbing days of winter, or the wet, bone-chilling days of spring. When summer finally came and his 10-day confinements in the crate continued, the insects returned, and so did the memories of his first days in the box. Again his skin swelled up from the bites of mosquitoes, black flies, and no-see-ums. Surprisingly, in spite of the moderate temperatures outside, many days in the stable under the tin roof turned oppressively warm. This brought problems again with cleanliness, since Nikolai was not allowed out of the box to go to the bathroom. And of course, this just made the fly problem even worse. All that summer, Nikolai endured the sessions of being confined in the wooden box. All that summer, he would approach the Sabbath with stubborn faithfulness and a tenacity that impressed even the warden. If Nikolai could have seen how it really affected the warden, he would have been greatly encouraged. Nevertheless, the warden would not give in, and back Nikolai would go to the box each Sabbath. He would endure his 10-day sentence, be released, and then suffer great anguish as he worked to regain the use of his legs. Then he would spend a couple of days working with Vadim on camp repairs and projects before being locked up again in the box. As fall arrived and once again stretched into winter, Nikolai became known as the preacher in the box. He hated to think that his time in the box was being wasted, and some days he had to wonder what in the world God's long-range plan might be. He had heard of saints who suffered in prison for 20 and 30 years, and he dreaded the possibility of such a fate. But even that didn't seem to deter him much anymore. It seemed to be part of Nikolai's routine now, a part of who he was and who he had become. Most days he wasn't sure which would be better, to live another day and suffer the slow, painful deterioration of his body through such torture, or experience a quick death that would end his earthly life. But, again, it didn't really matter. Hadn't his life already been one long trial of persecutions for the sake of the gospel? Why question God's plan now? Nikolai truly did trust his heavenly Father. Someday all would be clear. In the meantime, he tried not to ask too many philosophical questions about the quality of life or about God's overall plan for him. He just kept quoting scriptures that promised answers someday, and this gave him simple strength to endure yet another day. All things work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. He would recite to himself countless times while in the box. All the verses he had memorized in his life were coming back to him now, and they were a real source of comfort in his time of need. Do not fear any of those things that you are about to suffer. Indeed, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison, that you may be tested, and you will have tribulation 10 days. This part of the verse always made Nikolai smile, ironically. He knew the verse was more symbolic than literal, but still it was satisfying to think that John the Revelator had used the very number of days in the prophecy that matched the number of days Nikolai was having to suffer each time in the box. Be faithful unto death, and I will give you a crown of life. That was the part of the passage that always gave him the greatest hope. It reminded him that nothing really mattered in life except that he remained faithful to Jesus. And so to witness for God in a communist prison was truly a privilege. As far as Nikolai could tell, there were no Christians in the camp. He could hardly believe that, but as of yet, none had shown their true colors or dared to come forward, even if just to encourage him. But if his witness for Jesus could bring even one soul to Christ, he felt that it would be worth it. All the pain and hardship he had endured would stand for something. It would not be for nothing. And who knew? If one man were brought to Jesus, maybe others would follow. Another cold winter followed on the heels of autumn, and then spring edged its way into camp. One spring day, when Nikolai was once again pulled from the box, he lay there in the straw looking out through the stable doorway. The month of May had come, and although this time of year was still quite cool, the sunshine and clear blue sky warmed his heart. As Nikolai slowly flexed his legs, trying to get the kinks out of his knees, he thanked God for life. He thanked Jesus for the chance to be a living witness for Christ instead of being a martyr. It was amazing that he could endure such hardship and not resent the leading of his heavenly Father. But it was famous lines from Scripture that always kept him upbeat in his attitude towards life. One of his favorite was from the writings of Paul. "For I have learned in whatever state I am to be content." And that, of course, was what always made the difference. How could it not? Nikolai had given his life totally to God, and God was giving him just what he needed day by day until the time was right to reveal the next phase of his divine plan. Chapter 19. A few weeks later, unusual guests showed up at the prison camp. 3 military officers rode in on horses, and it was obvious by their appearance that one of them was a high-ranking colonel in the army, all the way from Nizhny Novgorod. It soon became clear that they were there to inspect the camp. The warden pulled out all the stops and made quite a show of things. Not that he had anything remarkable to brag about at the prison camp. It was a standard camp out in the middle of nowhere on the Siberian steppes, housing some 300 prisoners with no notorious or political criminals among them. But guests at the camp were rare, so giving these special visitors a tour was the biggest thing that had happened at camp in years. They were shown the officers' quarters, the kitchen and mess hall, and the barracks. Nikolai could hear their conversation as the tour took them near the stables. "What's in here?" the colonel asked, pointing at the low-roofed shed where Nikolai's box was kept. The warden glanced through the open doorway of the stable. He had put Nikolai in the box just 3 days before, but he had hoped to avoid having to explain the situation to the colonel. "Oh, this is where we house the worst prisoners," he said nonchalantly. "Severe punishment keeps the insubordinate ones under control." "What types of punishment?" "Oh, various ones." The warden squirmed. The officer stepped through the doorway and peered into the dim shadows of the stable. "We keep them locked up in boxes like that one." The warden pointed at Nikolai's wooden crate in the corner. "How many prisoners are locked up right now?" The officer was painfully persistent, and Nikolai could sense the uneasiness in the warden's voice. "Well, we only have one man in here right now." And he's in here for what, specifically?" "For refusing to carry out his duties." The officer stepped closer to the wooden crate, but immediately stepped back as his nose caught a whiff of the foul stench coming from the crate. "Whew!" he exclaimed. "And how long have you been punishing him for this sort of insubordination?" The warden scratched his head. "Only 3 days this time so far, but he's in for a 10-day stint." "A 10-day stint?" The colonel looked skeptical. "And you say he won't work? How many times has he been insubordinate?" "Well, now, he's been giving us trouble ever since he arrived in camp." The warden's eyes darted back and forth between the box and the colonel. "Every time we let him out, he disobeys again, so we just put him back in the box." The colonel looked at the box again. "And you've tried this how many times?" I guess, we've been doing it for pretty close to 2 years now." The colonel looked at the warden incredulously, his mouth dropping open in disbelief. Through the cracks in the crate, Nikolai watched the whole thing transpire, and with bated breath, he waited for the conversation to continue. It was becoming more and more apparent that the colonel did not approve of such crude forms of treatment. and it also appeared as though the warden was about to get reprimanded for it. 2 years? Yes, sir. You've had this man locked up in this tiny box for 10-day stints repeatedly during the last 2 years? That must be some 40 or 50 times at least. The warden looked embarrassed. He paused and then finally replied, Well, yes, I'd say that's about right. Do you mean to tell me that you've been locking this man up in this crate for 2 years and it hasn't done any good? Even with this type of punishment, he's still being disobedient or insubordinate or whatever you want to call it? The colonel was getting more irritated by the minute. Did it ever occur to you, officer, that there may be a good reason why this man isn't following your orders? I mean, 2 years and he still hasn't come around? The warden looked shocked and bewildered and aghast, all in the same instant. Well, did you? No, sir. It didn't occur to me just like that, but now that you put it that way, it does sound pretty ridiculous. Ridiculous? The colonel almost shouted. I'd say it sounds ridiculous. Totally idiotic, if you ask me. In fact, I'm beginning to question who the intelligent one is around here. Certainly not you, he continued to glare at the warden. I ought to have your commission revoked for running such an operation. This isn't discipline, it's just plain torture. We Russian officers may be tough and mean as wildcats, but we're not animals. Chapter 20. The colonel abruptly turned back to the crate. Open the box, he ordered, his voice still livid with anger. Open the box at once. Yuri came forward and opened the lock that held the latch. He lifted the lid and reached into the box to help Nikolai stand to his feet. It had only been 3 days since Nikolai had been put into the box, but by now his legs were already like rubber. He tried to stand without wavering, but he couldn't. The strength was just not there. With so few days between the stints in the box, he had slowly lost the ability to recuperate quickly, and each time his legs would atrophy a little more. Here, lay him in this pile of straw over here, the colonel barked, and get him a drink of water. He waved his hand to ward off the flies and the stench that was permeating the shed. And bring a bucket of water so he can clean himself up. The colonel turned to Nikolai and shook his head again. What's your name, young man? Panchuk, sir. Nikolai Panchuk. The officer continued looking kindly at Nikolai. Is it true what the warden says, that you won't work? No, it's not true. Nikolai swallowed some of the water from the cup Yuri handed him. I will work. I'll work harder than all the other prisoners if need be. I'll get up early and stay up late every night, but I can't dishonor God and work on his holy Sabbath day. The colonel raised his eyebrows. The 7th day of every week is God's Subbata, Nikolai continued, seeing the opportunity to witness once again about his beloved Sabbath. I was raised to keep it holy, and I can't violate my conscience, sir. On the 7th day of each week, I can't work because it would be disobeying the commands of my God. Nikolai wanted to be respectful of the officer, but right now he was lying in a pile of straw. It was hard to stand at attention or salute the colonel while lying prostrate on the stable floor. The nervousness showed on his face. At ease, prisoner, came the colonel's reassuring command as he stared down at Nikolai. What did you do for a living before you came to this camp? I was a pastor, sir. It's why I was sent here in the first place, because I wouldn't turn over a list of my church members to the KGB. Nikolai's voice wavered and then almost broke with emotion as he added, I could not, sir. It would have betrayed the confidence my members had placed in me as their spiritual leader. Nikolai felt strange. Why was he baring his soul to this unknown army officer? He felt chagrined and relieved at the same time. He couldn't explain it, but somehow it seemed the right thing to do at this point. So you will work, but you won't work on Saturdays? Your Subbata, as you call it? Yes, sir. I'll work hard before sunup and well after dark to make up for the time I miss on Saturdays. The colonel looked at the warden. Do you have a job like this? One that can be done on some days and not others? A job that can be done in fewer days if this man works more hours each of the other days? The warden thought for a moment. Well, there is the water that needs to be brought from the spring a kilometer away. He glanced at the colonel. We need barrels of water, and it usually takes a man and an ox 7 days of hauling to bring enough water for the camp. Enough for drinking water, cooking, and any washing the men need to do. The warden looked at Nikolai, lying in the straw, and then at the colonel. I suppose we could give that a try. The man doing it now works from dawn till dusk and barely has enough time to bring the 9 or 10 barrels of water that we need on average per day. If Panchuk wants to get up and work before dawn each day and then work after dark, maybe he can manage to bring enough by Friday night. I doubt it, but we can give it a try. The warden had a cynical look in his eye, but he chose his words carefully in front of the colonel. The officer brightened. All right then, Panchuk, it's a deal. Let's see what you can do. Tomorrow is Tuesday. The warden says that if you can bring enough water by Friday night, you can have your day off. 5 days of work in 4. If you can do it, then Saturday is a free day. And then the colonel got a serious look in his eye as he looked straight at Nikolai. But if you can't keep up your end of the bargain, you're going to have to haul water on Saturdays too. Your subata, as you call it. Are we clear on this? Absolutely. I'm curious, Panchuk. The colonel searched Nikolai's face. Although it was filled with pain, it held the peace of heaven. You have been so stubborn in refusing to work on your subata, he continued. What happens if Saturday comes and you still don't have enough water? We've got a deal, and yet somehow I get the feeling that you will probably still choose to go into the box rather than to work and violate your holy day. Nikolai thought about the question before answering the kindest Russian military officer he had ever met. He chose his words carefully because he wanted to honor the colonel's faith in him and the warden's willingness to give him a chance to prove himself. If I honor my God, he will honor me, sir. He knows I wish to worship him in prayer and quiet meditation on that day, so I am placing my confidence in him, that he will give me the strength to complete the challenge. I will work half the night, if need be, just to complete my part of the bargain and secure for myself the right to worship my God on that day. You know, I believe you will, the colonel nodded and smiled kindly. The man's generosity made Nikolai feel warm inside, and it gave him hope that everything would turn out for the best after all. It seemed that this was the break he had been hoping for, the chance that he had been wanting for 2 years, a chance to show everyone the sovereignty of his God. Nikolai rested the remainder of the day, trying to limber up and get his knees to work again. By nightfall, he felt pretty good. However, as he lay on his bunk that night in the barracks, he thought about the distance to the spring. It had to be about 1 kilometer, maybe a little more. That would be almost 3 kilometers each round trip. Nikolai figured that it would take maybe 2.5 to 3 hours for each load of water. From what he had seen, the ox cart carried 2 barrels at a time, so that meant he needed to haul 5 loads a day to bring the quota of water per day. But he needed to haul enough water for Saturday's supply too. There was no question about it. Nikolai knew that he was going to have to haul at least 1 or 2 extra loads a day to make it. With his mind whirling, he took time to pray before dozing off. Lord, help me not to worry. Help me to have the energy I need to take on this amazing challenge. It is truly a challenge straight from the courts of heaven. And chapter 21. Yes, I think we'll do chapter 21. Before dawn had even lit the eastern sky, the next morning, Nikolai was out at the stables helping Oleg, the ox cart driver, hitch up old Maxim. Oleg would be working with Nikolai for the day to teach him the routine of hauling water from the spring. Nikolai knew that this was his chance to win Sabbath privileges and be a powerful witness for God. For 2 years now, he had been confined repeatedly in a wooden box for 10 days at a time because he wouldn't work on the Sabbath. But he had remained true to his convictions and suffered everything the warden could throw at him. Now God had provided Nikolai a way of escape for the torture from the torture box, with his faith still intact. It was time for Nikolai to witness in a different sort of way. There was so much at stake. Would God help Nikolai to do what seemed to be an impossibility? Could Nikolai and Maxim haul 7 days' worth of water in just 6 days of work each week? And this week the task was even more daunting. 5 days' worth of water in 4? In Nikolai's mind, it would take a miracle. But that was, of course, what God was all about. It was what Nikolai's busy life as a pastor had been all about. It was what his interrogation episodes with the KGB had been about. His eventual sentence at this prison camp and his confinement in the box for refusing to work on the Sabbath day. And it was what his release and new assignment with Maxim were all about. Nikolai's life of sacrifice and service to God had been one miracle after another, and Nikolai doubted that the miracles would stop now. There was too much at stake. And so it was that Nikolai and Oleg set out for the spring across the treeless steppes. It took them more than an hour to make the trek as they walked along laboriously behind the plodding ox. "Can't we make this old ox hurry any faster?" Nikolai complained as the ox cart lumbered slowly along past muskegs and around bogs. "If he walks this slow all day, we'll never get our 5 loads in by the end of today." "Oh, we'll get the water in all right, but old Maxim has never promised me that we'd do it before dark. Often we come trudging in long after dark. You should know that. You were there in the shed to witness it a lot of times." Nikolai stared at Oleg, a stunned look settling in on his face. If they couldn't manage the regular number of loads in a given day, how were they going to be able to get the extra barrel of water hauled to camp? Oleg just shook his head. "I guess you thought this was going to be an easy job," he snorted. No, not actually, but I was hoping we would be able to get Maxim to move along a little faster." Oleg made a face and shook his head again. "Look, I'm sorry that you had to stay cooped up in that box, and I'm glad the colonel let you out, but this business of getting more barrels of water so that you can have your day off is crazy. Old Maxim here knows nothing about any of that. All he knows is that when he wants to walk, he walks. And when he wants to walk slower, there's nothing you can do to hurry him up." Nikolai wanted to say something, but he didn't. "I know what you're thinking," Oleg kept on. "You were thinking that since you're a preacher man, your God would work out some kind of miracle. I'm right, aren't I?" Oleg gave the ox a slap on his rump. "You thought your God would reach down out of the sky above and tickle old Maxim's ear and something to make him walk faster, didn't you? And then Maxim would run like nobody's business and have all the water for the week hauled to the camp in 6 days. Hey, maybe even 5. Oleg was still shaking his head. His reaction seemed logical enough. Should Nikolai have expected anything less? He had thought that the other prisoners might admire him for standing up for what he believed in, but maybe that wasn't the case at all. Maybe they had no respect for a man who wouldn't work, especially if he was asking for one day of work off in 7. All the men were working hard, and they were all being held at this prison camp against their will. Then, too, like the warden, they didn't know a thing about Nikolai's God, or the devotion he had for his Maker. Nikolai had nothing more to say, so he walked the remainder of the distance in silence. What was the use? The first rays of sunshine were just beginning to peek over the horizon when they arrived at the spring. Nikolai helped Oleg dip wooden buckets into the pool of water at the spring and then pour them into the barrels waiting on the ox cart. It wasn't a hard task, but several times Nikolai sloshed water from the buckets on himself. The morning air was still chilly, and the cold water made Nikolai shiver. He realized that if he wanted to stay dry, he was going to have to learn how to put more water in the barrels and less on himself. Besides, if he was careless, it would take that much longer to fill the barrels. Oleg put the wooden lids on the 2 barrels and then nudged Maxim forward with his ox goad. Nikolai was glad to see that Oleg no longer used his leather prod to beat Maxim. He used the goad instead to guide the ox and send him signals as to what he wanted him to do. The trip back to camp took even longer since the cart was loaded down with full barrels of water. Several times Nikolai tried to urge Maxim along faster, but always the old ox resisted his efforts. In fact, any attempts to hurry him along seemed to make him move even slower. If Nikolai could have gotten into the harness to help Maxim pull the cart along faster, he thought that he would gladly do it. As it was, he and Oleg were at the mercy of Maxim and his whims to move along at his own pace. In the end, Nikolai realized Oleg was right. There was nothing they could do but walk along patiently beside the cart. All right, that's it for tonight. But thanks for following along with our story. We'll see you tomorrow for another section of the 7th Day Ox.